Hello and welcome to DNET, the Disability Network. I'm Bill McQueen.
And I'm Meng Wong. Over the last few years, governments have been placing more and more emphasis on balancing their budgets and achieving that goal through cutbacks. Today, we'll hear reaction to provincial cuts from across the country. We'll look at how people with disabilities are being affected.
Also in today's program, we'll meet a policeman who uses a wheelchair. He works with street gangs and coaches young hockey players. We'll find out how these two parts of his life are connected. First, here are some highlights of disability stories from the last few weeks. The Toronto Transit Commission operates the city's Wheel-Trans system. Last week, it proposed changes that would cut ridership by more than 30%. When the proposal went before the Commission on Tuesday, it drew an angry response from users. Satinder Bindra reports on the controversy.
Blanche Feld uses a taxi provided by Wheel-Trans to go to the hospital a few times every month. She pays one subway token for each ride. But now the TTC wants to eliminate that service.
Right now we're only using it absolutely necessary for medical appointments. But there are quite a lot of those. So I don't know what we'll do. We'll have to if we have to take our own cabs, we'll have to limit it to as little as we can.
About 24,000 people use Wheel-Trans. The service is provided to only those who can't walk 175 meters or climb 3 steps. But faced with shrinking subsidies, TTC General Manager David Gunn wants fewer people to use the system. Gunn calls his plan redefining Wheel-Trans's core business.
We've defined this simply as providing service to persons who use wheelchairs, scooters, walkers, or devices for mobility, such as walkers, and then trips for dialysis.
Gunn says anyone who can walk, even if it's a few meters, cannot use the system. His plan has angered many Wheel-Trans users.
The definitions provided for core business are offensive and nothing less. Clearly, for a service provider...
At today's meeting, commissioners ruled Gunn must work with the Citizens Committee to decide who should be allowed to use Wheel-Trans. Their revised plan will be presented to the board in about 2 weeks. Satinder Bindra, CBC News, Toronto.
Several institutions implicated in Canada's blood supply scandal have filed motions to restrain the Crever Commission from apportioning blame. The inquiry has found that tainted blood infected about 1,200 Canadians with HIV and about 12,000 others with a very serious form of hepatitis. The institutions, including the Canadian Red Cross, the federal government, and 4 drug companies, are concerned that if the inquiry singles them out, they could be subject to criminal or civil charges. The attempt to stop anyone from being blamed has angered the Canadian Hemophilia Society. President Derhain Wong Rieger says if those responsible aren't held accountable, Canadians can't expect the system to change. The inquiry's final report is due this fall. Last week, a toddler from Panama was in Canada for a life-saving operation. The efforts of people from 2 provinces made the operation possible. Susan Adaskin filed this report the day before the surgery.
2-year-old Annalika Campos was born with Down syndrome. She also has a hole in her heart. Without surgery, Annalika will die. The operation isn't available in Panama, where the Campos family lives.
You look pretty today.
So they've come here.
I very emotional. I very thank you.
The Alberta and Saskatchewan Associations for Community Living joined forces to make the operation possible. The groups support parents of children with mental handicaps. Campos was in Canada for a conference. His daughter's story touched the hearts of people with the Alberta group.
We promised Manuel that he didn't have to look anymore.
A surgeon wasn't available in Alberta, so the operation is being done in Saskatoon. The family says in Panama, children with disabilities are last on the list of those sent away for surgery. Here, Angelika's disability made no difference.
Here, it didn't raise any issues, actually. Here, everybody cooperated quite willingly. As you know, from the physicians, of course, donating their time to Toys R Us donating toys.
All costs, about $70,000, are being covered by the associations and donations.
Every family has the right to believe that their children are going to be protected and that we're going to do whatever possible to ensure that they have an opportunity to a healthy life.
Angelica has her chance now. She went into the hospital around noon. The hole in her heart will be repaired tomorrow. Susan Nadaskin, CBC News, Saskatoon.
A 35-year-old woman with Down syndrome, Sandra Jensen, also had a major operation last week. Originally, she was turned down for surgery because of her disability. The heart-lung transplant took place in San Francisco on Tuesday. Grant Mitchell, the leader of the Liberal Party in Alberta, says seniors are being hurt by cuts to health care in that province. This week, he outlined the party's new policy on long-term care. Mitchell thinks the Department of Health must be held responsible for maintaining a certain standard of care. He proposes that long-term care providers be licensed and programs be developed to assist seniors to stay at home longer. Mitchell estimates such programs could save at least 10% of the $500 million being spent each year on long-term care. And that's this week's roundup of disability stories.
When we come back, we'll find out how people with disabilities are being affected by government cutbacks.
This program is brought to you in part by the Royal Bank of Canada, serving Canadians for 126 years, one customer at a time. We hear about it every day. Provincial governments across the country are making cuts to social programs, welfare, and health care. They're aimed at reducing government deficits, and everyone is supposed to share some of the pain. People with disabilities have been no exception. Earlier, 3 people from different parts of the country joined ING to discuss the way people with disabilities are being affected. Bruce Yuditsky is the Executive Director of the Alberta Association for Community Living. Mary Reid is the Executive Director of Civic 4, an independent living resource center in Newfoundland. And Hugh Scher is with the Council of Canadians with Disabilities.
Bruce, let's start with you. How have people with disabilities in your province been affected by cuts?
Well, I think actually been affected differentially depending on what kind of disability you may have and what kind of supports you need. So while there have been examples of cuts through family and social services, these have been largely initially absorbed by agencies, and today those people with disabilities receiving supports through family and social services are basically being able to receive the supports and services that they need. There aren't any waiting lists, services are accessible, etc. However, if you were to receive or need your supports through health because of a physical disability, for example, there's a much larger concern given both the depth of the cuts to the healthcare system and the restructuring. So people have felt particularly vulnerable in that system to having their supports reviewed, to the potential for cutbacks from having been moved from one facility to the other, to the use of institutions for relief, to reductions in potentially direct home care and so on.
Mary, what about Newfoundland? What's happening there?
This definite fear that the loss of home care and adequate supports for people to enable them to live within their own homes may be removed and people may be forced into institutional living. And that's of grave concern here, and that individuals are saying that that will not be an option.
Here we have a new government in Ontario. How have they affected people with disabilities?
Well, the new government came in on the promise that it wasn't going to be affecting programs for people with disabilities at all. And the first thing that it did in one of its first announcements was to change the definition of disability. They came back and retracted that, indicating that it was a mere oversight and a drafting error. But I think what it shows is a far more pervasive theme within our new Ontario government, which is to cut wherever possible. As a sort of slash and burn mentality, and if people with disabilities happen to get in the way, they are going to be affected.
Mary, what about Newfoundland? How are people being directly affected by changes the provincial governments are making?
Certainly individuals are being affected, especially in rural areas where there is very little programs in place now in terms of mental health support. And with the current changes that are happening in Newfoundland and the economic uncertainties and the pressures that's putting on that mental health system that can barely maintain itself now, we're seeing more and more people in need of services and support within their communities, and that's just not available to them.
Bruce, how are families going to be affected by cuts?
Access to early intervention for preschool, very young children is under some degree of concern and threat. We have waiting lists, which of course is a contradiction in terms to have early intervention. We have parts of the province where there's no early intervention for children with disabilities.
Now, it's my understanding from what I read in the daily papers and hear on television that government is put in the position of having to do this because the deficit is growing, and everyone should share the pain. How would you respond to that? Hugh, let's start with you.
We're adopting the kind of slash and burn Reaganomics mentality that was prevalent in the United States over the course of the 80s. And the fear is that unless we slash our deficits now, unless we do everything we can to reduce spending, that we're not going to be able to get out of this monstrous debt.
Isn't this what the public wants? Isn't this what they're demanding from government?
I think the public is demanding it of government at this time, but I think it's short-sighted. Over the course of time, when we realize that after having cut and made the kind of deep cuts in social spending that we're doing now, that the deficit and debt continues to mount and is not being decreased.
As the cuts took hold and more ordinary citizens were affected, I think there's a growing concern across this province that they've gone too far. As long as the pain was distributed to those that were less valued by society or were disadvantaged and on the margins, people seem to be more willing to go along with it.
I agree with both Bruce and Hugh, in that the public really hasn't been given accurate information, and the whole issue that the deficit is due to social spending is one that's erroneous in the first place. And the human costs and financial costs of making huge cuts to social spending is one that's going to play out as not being of any assistance towards cutting any deficits.
Very quickly now, what do you think the solution should be?
Solutions are found by individuals themselves and by being able to not have consultations as happened during the social policy reform by Axworthy and his traveling circus, but real, true input and participation in the decision making. And once that starts happening on a sincere and real level, that the solutions will come forward as more practical ways of having social programs.
One more concern, and that is the mean-spiritedness that I still see out there. So the other day we had an article, an editorial in the Calgary Herald accusing people with mental and physical handicaps of becoming violent and that perhaps they belonged in institutions. So I think even while we work at solutions, we need to keep touch with the community attitudes and not let those slip any further than they already have.
Well, I think people with disabilities have to be taking an active role in engaging in the public debate, and I think that we have to be bringing the debate back to its fundamental principles, in particular focusing on the values of equality and respect and dignity, which have founded our movement and which we as individuals, I believe, provide meaning to our citizenship, and hopefully we can provide that to the public debate as well.
I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and to share your ideas, and I'm sure this is an issue that we'll be revisiting in the future.
We'd like to know what you think. What are your thoughts about the direction governments are taking? Are cuts to social spending the answer to deficit problems? We'd also like to know if you or someone you know has been affected by the cuts. Our address is coming up at the end of the show.
When we return, a story about hockey, street gangs, and a cop with a commitment. What happens when a gang of kids get together? The result can be bad or it can be good. Our next story is about someone who's seen both sides. For over 11 years, Brian Kewen's been putting in an extra effort to help kids stay on the right track. CBC producer April Stevens caught up with him at a local hockey arena in a suburb of
goes. Sean, you hear the whistle, full tilt. 2 hands. I guess I basically got it because I love hockey. I don't like kids. 1 whistle, remember, full tilt, right guys? Hurry up, get up, Robin. Let's go! I'm Brian Kewen. I've been coaching hockey, minor hockey for the last 11 years in Scarborough with the Agincourt Lions Hockey League. Bring it in! I wanted to give something back to the boys. I wanted to give back something to hockey. I've played hockey in Scarborough all my life. Hey guys, listen up. Skate around, you hear the whistle once, go down on the ice, get up.
Well, he's not like all those other coaches yelling and screaming at you, telling you what to do and stuff like that. He's kind of easy.
You're gonna get hurt if you're gonna stay here.
No. I do believe, and Jerry and I both teach the boys good sportsmanship and fun. Teach them how to play good positional hockey. That's it, hug those boards.
He's really friendly. He's not like get out there and win or else you don't get nothing. And he doesn't think winning is everything. He thinks like winning is good, but tying is good, and losing is fine too.
With the kids, he's fabulous with them. And he's a lot of fun to be around. I mean, he and I, we do this, we've had a lot of fun together for 10 years coaching.
11 years. 11 years with the kids, yeah. It was 4 years before my accident, the last 7 years after my accident. So it's been pretty good. Let's go, guys. Whoa.
He was on the emergency task force. He was a weightlifter in fabulous shape. And then about 8 years ago, we were coaching at the time, he got in a car accident and became a quadriplegic.
All of a sudden I went from being completely physical to completely paralyzed. So I had to reshape and figure all my priorities in life. But I wasn't sure how I was caught up on how am I going to coach hockey. And by the time I got out to the rink in the fall, they put some ramps in. They were able to accommodate me, and I was back coaching. That's the way, Zach. It's got a nice shot, eh? Fire it in! Lovely! I was scared to death at first. Now, I knew I could coach, but I wasn't quite sure how the parents would react to a guy coming out in a wheelchair, or maybe how the boys might react. It's the way, Petey. It's the way. Keep your head up. Okay, Tyler, go get him.
I think he'd be like more of a coach because he could follow us around in his wheelchair and just like stay with us and keep on like encouraging us.
Lovely. Right here, Tyler. Keep your stick down on the ice. I hope somewhere, I guess, that the lessons they learn through the hockey and the team play, they can see the positive aspect of team play. Lovely. This is also teamwork. It's destructive. Every one of these buildings back here, probably a quarter mile of laneway or a half mile laneway that's all been trashed. I guess we refer to us as somewhat of an alley rat. I work with Metropolitan Toronto Police Services, specializing in street crime and youth gangs. There's quite a few gangs in Toronto now. We're up somewhere around 160 active gangs in Toronto. They're rumored to be almost 800 strong, some of the kids. Others are 10, 12 kids in a gang. So what we're looking at back here, this is kind of the media for the street youth. And what they'll do is they'll use these as bulletin boards to communicate with one another out in the streets. This stuff tells a story, and so it's up to us to come out and read these walls and interpret them. What we're looking at here, this is all Latino gang graffiti. That's West Side, LL's, Latin Locos. Then you got Locos Forever. Then you got the cross with 3 dots. The cross with the 3 dots means Mi Vida Loca, which means my crazy life. I heard one of the graffiti artists themselves, they referred to graffiti as a hybrid between art and crime. I think that's a fairly accurate description here when we look at this stuff. You'll see the 187 symbol. 187 is the California Penal Code for homicide. And so they'll throw up the numbers 187 across somebody's tag. So it's basically a disrespect or a death threat to somebody else. People are getting shot and killed stateside over this stuff. It's all vandalism. You know, some of the taggers, that's all they're doing. Shoplifting the paint and whatnot, of course, and the markers. The gangs represent themselves publicly. Then you're looking at assaults, and a lot of them are dealing in stolen goods, other commodities, narcotics, whatnot, as well as extortion, street-level extortions. This is only, to me, this is just the outward manifestation of much deeper problems that we have within our society with the kids. A lot of kids have a lot of free time. There's less recreational alternatives for them. And of course, a lot of the recreational stuff now we're looking at coming up with user fees and whatnot. Kids on the streets don't have the money for the user fees. But it's not all definitely just street youth. I mean, we've got people that are coming, kids coming down here. You have kids involved here that have 2-parent working families. And of course, again, a lot of free time, no relationships. It's no good talking about the alternatives for gangs and, oh, you got to provide more recreation, unless you're willing to get out there and do it. Lovely! So I don't look at things that I can't do. I just keep focusing on the things I can do. I'll tell you, there's not enough time in the day. I really believe that if you live in a community, you have an inherent responsibility to contribute to that community. You really do. You got to get up and turn off the TV and get out into the community. A lot of the kids that get involved in the gangs, they don't have a good image of themselves, oftentimes a lack of self-esteem, and they're missing something. And this gives the kids an opportunity to do something constructive in the community. But if you're part of a community, you're going to be less apt to vandalize or assault people in that community. You know what? In coaching hockey, I've gotten a lot more out of coaching than what I've ever put in. I don't think there's much you can compare to watching a young boy score his first goal. You know, the big grin. And what motivates me is to see the boys grow up into young men and do the right things. Lovely! Yes!
When we return, school days. Find the word that doesn't match. A ruler, an eraser, a pencil, a dog.
A dog?
A dog.
Here's a short postscript to a story we ran a few weeks ago. It looked at the benefits of relationships between pets and people. This story by Catherine Harrop comes from a classroom in Fredericton, New Brunswick.
School is getting in. A gathering of socks and... hello? Abby's as curious as any other student, and at 2 years old, she's already in grade 4. After convincing the school principal, Bill Morrison brought her to his first school, a junior high, when she was 9 weeks old. He says she's a tool for reaching children with special needs, an icebreaker. For instance, he had a child who wouldn't read, except, as it turned out, to the dog. And to many kids, she's a comfort.
Bill, that's a new way that animals can help support people by making the classroom a friendlier and more informal place.
Well, Ing, there are lots of innovative ideas out there. And remember, we'd like to hear yours. Our address is coming right up. That's our program for this week. I'm Bill McQueen.
And I'm Ming Wong. See you again next week. You can write to us at Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6. That's Disability Network, CBC, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W1E6.
This program is brought to you in part by the Royal Bank of Canada, serving Canadians for 126 years, one customer at a time.